Thanks for coming to Productive Corporation's Technical Snapshot. Today we're going to take an in-depth look at Kaspersky's KSV.
Within the virtual environment, we do have what we call the agentless solution. It's actually going through a major revision that's going to add components to the support line. What I mean by that is this. A couple years ago, we came out with Kaspersky Security for Virtualization. It's an agentless solution that is integrated into the vSphere and vShield environments of VMware. Within that, we have the ability to replace that endpoint client that you install on every VM and remove it in favor of a virtual appliance. That virtual appliance now is going to handle all of the file scanning and all of the updating. So rather than have a scan task and an update task for every VM, you now have one scan task and one update task per host. All of these are licensed by either by VM or by the number of VMs that you have in your environment, or per core, just very similar to what you do with VMware. Now, the revision that I talked about is in reference to what we're going to be doing with Hyper-V and Citrix support. Hyper-V and Citrix support is going to be added as a secondary level of KSV later on this year. Hyper-V and Citrix support is going to be in the form of what we call a light agent. We're still going to use a virtual appliance, but because VMware has the tools already built into it, in the form of VM tools, Hyper-V and Citrix rely on other components that don't allow us to integrate that way. So we're going to use a light agent. That light agent is very, very small. That's going to basically handle all the communication to the virtual appliance. So it's still going to be very, very small in its footprint size, but still give you maximum protection, along with IDS and IPS security, in essence, firewalling. So now let's take a look at the KSV protection profile, or policy, if you will. This is going to be broken down into a couple of areas, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on them. This is based on the agentless solution we currently have using the VMware technologies. To begin with, there's a root protection profile. This is very similar to what you'd see with a traditional anti-malware or antivirus protection client policy, where we're going to enable real-time protection. We're going to set security levels, recommended, and so on. We're going to set an action on threat detection, meaning if I find an infected file, what am I going to do with it by default? And as you can see here, we're going to disinfect and delete it if the disinfection fails. And yes, there are still times when disinfections are going to fail due to the fact that the file may be locked or in use to the point where we cannot open it to disinfect the infected areas. So in some cases, we may need to delete it. There are other options, which we'll go over here in just a moment. And then there's another area here for exclusions. And there are many organizations that I've spoken with who've said, look, I don't want to have any exclusions. But unfortunately, because of the way software reacts in an organization, there is sometimes a need to exclude specific software packages or specific files from being scanned in real time due to the way that they're used. SQL is a great example of that. We don't necessarily want to prevent SQL from being scanned. We just don't want it being done in real time because of the performance impact that it takes. Every time a record is opened up, the entire database is scanned. When you multiply that by the number of users that may be hitting that database at one time, that SQL database can become unstable. So we want to make sure that we only do that in times when it's absolutely necessary, but we need to be aggressive with it. So that's why the exclusions are still there. Now this is what we call the root protection profile. Now with the root protection profile, this applies to every VM that's registered on that particular host. Now in some cases I may need to be very customized. I may have a host that has web servers or application servers or SQL servers. I may have VDI environments that I need to take into account. This is where we get into protection profiles. Nice thing about protection profiles is it gives you the ability to customize the real-time protection of those virtual machines. So as you can see here, I created a couple already, virtual desktop and file servers. These are going to be one of those traditional type profiles that you'll see in the environment. Not a lot of exclusions, probably not a lot of setting changes. But let's talk about Exchange or SQL. Those are the ones that we're definitely going to have some particular exclusions for. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just create one for SQL Server. Now, in the process of creating this, now I'm going to be able to set all of those settings that we looked at in the root protection profile, but it's only going to apply to SQL servers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my security level. And with the security level, now I can go in and specify what do I want to scan. Okay, do I want to scan everything? Do I want to scan archives, self-extracting files? Maybe. If we want to look at performance levels, yes, we're going to use a signature analysis based on our signatures that we use. But how deep do we want to go into those files? How deep do we want that analysis to be? Keep in mind, we are focusing on the virtual environment here. This is not that physical box that we see there that we can just hammer away at. In some cases, we may need to be a little more gentle in regards to that because we have multiple users hitting that virtual environment. But the nice thing is that this particular policy and this particular technology is specifically developed around that, where I can still do a deep scan. In the process of doing that, I also...
Marty, what's the resource difference between superficial to deep?
When we look at it from that standpoint, superficial is looking at basically looking at the file header itself, seeing if there's anything that's unrecognizable that may potentially be a piece of malware. Medium is going to go, a quick scan through the file that it's scanning, and then a deep scan is going to look at every aspect of the file. So obviously, when we look at it from that standpoint, virtual or physical, the same thing still applies. We're going to look at a specific number of bytes of that file to determine whether or not there's potential malware risk, and then work from there. I would probably leave it at medium on anything other than storage devices. If you have, for example, a file server that's doing nothing more but housing home directories or shared directories, for example, I might do a deeper scan there because it's a shared resource that multiple people are sending files to and multiple people are retrieving files from. So we want to make sure that as those files are accessed, we want to make sure that they're virus or malware free.
Okay.
Okay. Along with that, now we look at the virtual environment from the standpoint. How much time do I want to spend looking at the file? We talked about the analysis from a heuristics level, but now let's look at it from the standpoint of its size. Okay, maybe we don't want to scan files for a long period of time because of the impact it'll have on the end user. We'll do that during a normal scheduled scan, or what we call an on-demand scan. So in this particular case, we actually have this feature in place that says scan files for no longer than 60 seconds. Obviously, this can be adjusted. Now, the nice thing here is when we talk about large files, large project files, AutoCAD drawings, Visio documents, that sort of thing, that are just so large in size that it might take longer for them to be scanned. Video, audio, those types of files can take an enormous amount of time to be scanned, even in the virtual environment. So in this particular case, we can say limit the file scan time to 60 seconds. And if not, just continue on, and I'll make sure that we definitely get it during the scheduled scan. And then, of course, what objects are we going to be detecting for? What are we going to be looking for? And that is traditional with any other anti-malware, especially us. So now that we've got our security levels taken into account, let's take a look at the action on threat detection. Now keep in mind, some cases you may have a retention policy that says you can't delete anything due to compliancy, due to company policy, due to preference. So we may not want to use the disinfect and delete, but we may want to use disinfect and block. Keep in mind, everything that we do is captured by an event that can be stored in the Windows log or in the Kaspersky log, and those will be available through the reporting components of Security Center. And then, of course, we can go ahead for possible infections. We can go ahead and block those as well. Now, in doing so, now, even though the file has been identified and it's being blocked, every time that file is accessed and it is blocked again, that event will be triggered. We can also set up notification that in the event that we do see that frequently, it can send information back to an administrator to take a look at that particular file much more in depth. Okay? And then we get into exclusions. Now we're focusing our attention on the SQL Server here, and we want to make sure that we don't scan specific aspects of SQL. Okay, not at least in real time. So I have a couple of options here. I can scan files except for except for specific extensions, or I can scan files just with those specific extensions. Since we want to put an exclusion in for the real-time databases, I can do something along these lines where I can scan everything except for maybe the MDBs, the LDS, maybe the log files, and so on. They're all separated by a comma. It's only going to look at those extensions and say, okay, exclude those. Or we can do what we see traditionally in a physical endpoint client where we can actually exclude the entire folder. Okay? And in doing so, we can go ahead and say include all the subfolders. Now I've got those intact. Now I can ramp up my antivirus on that SQL server and still scan it, aggressively scan it, but in the event that we hit the main database, it's just not going to scan it. If we hit the folder, it's not going to scan it. So now I've got something very specific centered around SQL Server. Same thing would apply for Exchange. We may exclude the Exchange folder or the Exchange database. So now I've got this intact. But how am I going to apply these particular profiles to the individual VMs on my host? This is where the protected infrastructure comes into play. Now, this particular infrastructure is very simple in nature. A simple host with a cluster with a number of VMs on it. So now, as you can see here, by default, the protection profile is the root for the entire environment and inherited throughout. But that's not what I want. I need that customization. So this is where I can go in and I can say, well, there's my SQL Server. Let me apply the SQL Server protection profile.
So
Marty, I've got some desktops in here.
Marty, do you have to build each one of those profiles yourself, or some of those out of the box that you can customize, or?
No. Actually, these are built after you purchase it. This is something that's done by the customer in that case. But here's the nice thing that we bring to the table with you guys. Like myself, we've got a great team of North American system engineers. And what we do is a lot of times when you start looking at our product or demoing our product, or what we do is a proof of concept. And we work a lot with the guys over at Productive so that you guys can actually experience it for yourself. Part of that process is to work hand in hand with one of our system engineers, where we would then discuss with you some of the aspects that you have in your virtualized environment. And in doing so, we'll help you actually build those out and show you how to tune them appropriately. So you're not going into this cold. Everybody looks at the wonderful the RTFM phrase that you tend to hear. Read that fine manual. Well, you're not just getting the manual with us. You're getting you're not just getting all that documentation that you can get online. You're getting a systems engineer. You've got a great support team and a local presence, if you will, from guys like you over at Productive. So we've got a great team working with you to make sure that this is successful.
Okay, so, awesome.
So we'll go ahead and continue here. Now, keep in mind, we're going to be very customized with this. And I'm going to go ahead and maybe apply a few others here. Get these all applied in. Now, keep in mind, there are going to be instances where you may have a need to disable protection because there's an appliance sitting out there, or there's a unique VM that you just don't want to protect. Okay? In that particular case, for example, I'm going to use my vShield manager here. I'm going to actually disable protection, just like so. I can go down a little bit further and, maybe I'm going to take my vCenter appliance and disable the protection for it as well. This gives you a lot of customization. The nice aspect here is if you have multiple hosts in your environment and you use vMotion, as long as they're part of the same vCenter environment, I don't have to reconfigure these when you move them from one host to another, because our policy is applied at the vCenter level. So it's going up at that top layer. So if you have multiple hosts within the vCenter environment, the need for reconfiguration is no longer there. So all of these things will hold true even if they move within the environment. A couple of the other things we definitely want to talk about is the KSN settings. Now, KSN is the Kaspersky Security Network. This network is a global database. It's a file reputation service that we use that complements the signatures that you get from Kaspersky. So basically what would happen in this case is that if we identify a potential risk that doesn't match a known signature, it will go out to the cloud and it will look to see if that occurrence exists out in the cloud. And if so, what was the remediation process for that particular threat? So now you're not just relying on signatures any longer. There is a heuristic associated to that and a cloud-based presence that's all encompassed within the same console, within the same product. And it does apply to the virtual world as well.
Thanks again for coming to view exclusive content on ProductiveCorp.com, your security and storage software expert for mid-sized companies. If you have questions about pricing or licensing your specific environment, give us a call or request a quote on Productive Corp.